The Manor That Hid a Second Story, a Miss Marple Case. Section 1. The Second Chimney of Oakham Manor. The village of St Mary Mead awoke on the second Tuesday of June with the placid certainty of a place that had never expected any morning to be otherwise. Bees moved with businesslike dignity over the vicarage lavender, the milk cart rattled along the lane with its punctual clink of bottles, and Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast window with a piece of toast in one hand and her mother's silver butter knife in the other, watched the postman turn the corner precisely 1 minute later than usual. It was, she reflected, the sort of morning in which nothing would happen, except, of course, that something already had, though the village would not learn of it for another quarter of an hour. The disturbance came, as such things so often do in villages, in the form of a small boy running very fast for no obvious profit. Master Toby Fenwick, the butcher's youngest, pelted past Miss Marple's gate with his cap in his fist and his bootlaces trailing, and Miss Marple, who had been watching a bullfinch investigate her gooseberries, set down her butter knife with a soft click. Boys of Toby's age did not run in that particular fashion, knees high, elbows tight, mouth ajar, unless they had seen something the grown-ups had told them not to see. It was, she thought mildly, very like the summer her nephew Raymond had been 10, and had come running from Farmer Hodgson's barn with just that expression, having stumbled upon a litter of kittens the farmer intended, unsentimentally, to drown. A moment later, Mrs. Bantry's motor drew up at the gate with a squeal quite unbecoming its coachwork, and Dolly Bantry herself, hatless and pink about the collarbones, was already halfway up the path before her chauffeur had switched off the engine. "Jane," she said, in a voice pitched half an octave above her Sunday one, "you must come at once. Colonel Prothero Vane is dead at Oakham Manor, and Inspector Slack has already been there for an hour, and he is being Inspector Slack." She sat down abruptly on the hall chair. "There is a second chimney, Jane. That is the thing. There is a second chimney where there ought only to be one." Miss Marple, who did not usually permit herself to be hurried, permitted herself now. She fetched her grey knitted shawl from its peg, checked that the back door was on the latch, and allowed Mrs. Bantry to bundle her into the motor with a solicitude usually reserved for invalids and small dogs. As the hedges of the lane began to blur past the window, she folded her gloved hands in her lap and said, in the mild, inquiring tone that had once undone a bishop and a bookmaker in the same afternoon, "A second chimney, dear. Do tell me exactly what you mean." Oakham Manor stood on a low hill 3 miles beyond the village, a long grey Elizabethan house with mullioned windows, a great deal of ivy, and, as any village child could have told you, one broad brick chimney rising like a stout Georgian gentleman from the western gable. This morning, however, catching the 6 o'clock sun on his walk to church, the sexton, Mr. Beale, had glanced up and seen a thin curl of smoke rising not from the western gable, but from the eastern one, where no chimney had ever been in the memory of the village, or the memory of the parish register, which went back to 1642. When Mr. Beale, being a man of thorough temperament, had walked round to check, he had found a chimney there indeed, narrow, of newer brick, half hidden by ivy, and quite unmistakable. It was as he was returning along the terrace, marvelling at how a man might live 70 years in a parish and never notice a chimney, that he had heard, through the open library window, the sound of Mrs. Prothero Vane beginning, very quietly and quite without hysteria, to scream. Colonel Prothero Vane had been found in the library, seated in his high-backed chair with a decanter of port at his elbow, the fire cold in the grate, and a small, neat wound at the base of his skull. There was, according to Mrs. Bantry, who had it from Griselda Clement, who had it from the vicar, who had spoken briefly with Dr. Haydock at the gate, no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, and no sign whatsoever of any weapon. The colonel, a man notorious for his rigidity of routine, had been reading, or had appeared to be reading, the 3rd volume of a set of memoirs by a general nobody else in England had ever heard of, and his reading spectacles lay folded on the arm of his chair, as though he had removed them courteously to greet his murderer. He was not, Mrs. Bantry said, as they turned in at the manor gates, a well-liked man, Jane. One must be honest about that. He shouted at the tenants, and he shortened the church path, and he refused to have the fete on the lower lawn last summer because he said Mrs. Weatherby's Pekingese had been sick on the box hedge, which of course it had, but a gentleman does not say so. She lowered her voice, though there was no one to overhear. There will be no shortage of people who did not weep last night. Miss Marple made no reply. She was looking, with mild and untroubled interest, at the eastern gable, where a thread of grey smoke, no thicker than a pencil line, was still rising into the clear June sky. It rose, she noticed, in a manner both apologetic and persistent, as though it had been rising quietly for a very long time, and only this morning had chosen, for reasons of its own, to be seen. Constable Polk, red-faced and perspiring, admitted them at the great oak door with the air of a man who has been asked one too many questions before his second cup of tea. Inspector Slack, whom Miss Marple had encountered on 3 previous occasions, and had, on each occasion, thoroughly and invisibly outmanoeuvred, was in the library, in a state of considerable brisk activity that concealed, as it always did, a fundamental and irritable uncertainty. He greeted Mrs. Bantry with civility, Miss Marple with a very small nod that was almost, but not quite, dismissive, and returned at once to the business of shouting quietly at his sergeant. Miss Marple did not enter the library. She stood instead in the doorway, her gloved hands folded, and looked past the colonel's still and dignified form to the wall behind him, where the panelling ran unbroken from floor to ceiling in a plain and unadorned oak. On the opposite wall, above the cold hearth, hung a large and rather bad oil painting of a hunting scene, in which a fox of anatomically improbable proportions was being pursued by hounds too dignified to be believed. She looked at the painting for what Mrs. Bantry afterwards described as an unreasonable length of time, and then she looked once at the ceiling. "How very curious," she said softly, to no one in particular, "that a house so old should have grown so quietly a second chimney. And how very sad," she added, almost as an afterthought, "that a man should die precisely underneath it." Outside, in the sunlit stable yard, a young woman in a green dress was standing quite still, with her hand pressed against the flank of a grey horse, and though she was not weeping, her face wore that particular stillness which, in Miss Marple's long experience, meant that a person had been weeping recently and would shortly begin again. The horse blew softly through its nostrils. The smoke rose. Somewhere, very far off, a wood pigeon began its liquid, indifferent call. Section 2. Tea, Theories, and the Quiet Woman. The wood pigeon was still calling when Miss Marple turned from the doorway and, with a small nod to Mrs. Bantry, walked slowly out onto the terrace. The young woman in the green dress had not moved. Her hand still rested on the grey horse's flank. Her cheek, though dry, held the faint dampness of a face very recently pressed against warm hide. Miss Marple did not approach her. She only paused at the balustrade, drew her shawl a little closer against the June breeze, and allowed her eyes to travel, without haste, from the eastern gable to the stable-yard and back again. "That," murmured Mrs. Bantry at her elbow, "is Miss Iris Prothero Vane. His niece, his ward, really, since her mother died. A quiet girl, reads a good deal, rides a good deal, says a good deal less than she thinks." Mrs. Bantry, who prided herself on the honest accuracy of her village portraits, added, "She is engaged to young Dr. Merrifield, the new man at the surgery, and the colonel disapproved most strenuously, on the grounds that Merrifield's grandfather had been in trade." "How very tiresome for her," said Miss Marple. "Extremely tiresome. He had threatened only last month to alter his will." Miss Marple's gloved hands folded themselves a little more tightly on the stone of the balustrade. "Ah," she said, in the tone of one confirming that the wren had, as suspected, laid 5 eggs and not 4. They did not linger. Inspector Slack, having established to his own satisfaction that a woman of 70 and a woman with pearl earrings had nothing material to contribute, had suggested, with as much politeness as he could manage before 11 o'clock, that the ladies might be more comfortable in the village. And so, by 12:30, Miss Marple was seated once again in her own parlour, with the tea things laid, and the news, having gathered speed on its way down the hill, arriving in waves at her door. Miss Hartnell came first, breathless and triumphant, bearing the intelligence that the gardener, old Podgett, had been heard the previous evening threatening the Colonel over the matter of a dismissed under-gardener. Miss Weatherby followed within 20 minutes, with the entirely contradictory information that old Podgett had spent the whole of the previous evening at the Blue Boar, playing dominoes with the sexton. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived at 3, having taken pains to change her hat, and reported, with the air of one who has personally seen the vision, that a strange man in a grey ulster had been observed on the London train at Much Benham the previous afternoon, and had asked the porter, in a foreign accent, for directions to Oakham Manor. By 4, the strange man had become 2 strange men. By 5, one of them was said to have carried a violin case, which, as Mrs. Price Ridley pointed out with a delicate shudder, everyone knew, from the cinema, was no longer used for violins. Miss Marple listened to each theory with the same grave courtesy. She poured tea. She offered seed cake. She agreed that the times were most unsettled and that one really could not be too careful, and she asked, on no fewer than 4 separate occasions, the same mild question. "And tell me, dear, the eastern gable. Had any of you, in all your years in the village, ever noticed a chimney there before?" None of them had. Miss Hartnell was certain there had never been one. Miss Weatherby was almost certain, but allowed that her eyesight at distance was not what it had been. Mrs. Price Ridley declared the whole matter of chimneys to be a distraction from the essential fact, which was that the Colonel had been foully murdered by a foreigner with a violin case, and that Miss Marple, whom she loved dearly, was permitting herself to be diverted by architecture. "Very possibly," Miss Marple murmured, and offered more cake. When the last of them had gone, and the parlour clock struck 6, she sat for a long while in the deepening light, her knitting on her lap and her hands still upon it. She was thinking, not of chimneys precisely, but of a woman she had once known in the village, a Mrs. Emily Combe, who had lived for 31 years in a cottage on the green with her invalid mother, and who, upon the mother's death, had been discovered to have kept, in the attic, a second and quite separate life. Letters, dresses, photographs, a name that was not her own. Mrs. Combe had not been a wicked woman. She had merely been, for 31 years, 2 women at once, and the strain of it had cost her, in the end, a good deal more than any of her neighbours had guessed. "People," Miss Marple said to the empty room, "are so often houses, and houses, dear me, are so often people." The village, meanwhile, had entered the peculiar second act which follows a country murder, that phase in which the initial thrill congeals into a set of local certainties, and each household has selected its preferred villain and defends the choice as a matter of loyalty. At the Blue Boar, opinion had settled upon old Podgett, on the reasonable ground that gardeners always know where the spade is kept. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement had proposed, mischievously, that the murderer must be Mrs. Prothero Vane herself, since she is the only person in the house who ever looked at him without wanting to hit him with something. At the surgery, young Dr. Merrifield, called upon to confirm the time of death, had returned white about the mouth and had refused, most uncharacteristically, his supper. Miss Marple heard of each of these developments in due course, for the village brought them to her as reliably as the milk. She noted them without comment. She noted, too, one further item, that Miss Iris Prothero Vane, upon returning from the stable-yard to the house, had gone not to her bedroom, nor to the drawing-room, nor to the housekeeper, but to the long gallery on the first floor, where she had stood for 11 full minutes, as the housemaid Lily had subsequently reported to her sister, who was Miss Marple's Gladys's cousin, in front of the eastern wall, which was blank and panelled and quite without ornament. 11 minutes, Miss Marple repeated softly to her knitting. That is a very long time to stand in front of nothing. Shortly after 7, Mrs. Bantry telephoned. Her voice, over the crackle of the village exchange, had the hushed excitement of one who has been permitted to overhear a professional secret. "Jane, Slack has arrested no one, but he is telling everyone, that he means to arrest Merrifield in the morning. It seems there was a quarrel 2 days ago, in the library, and the housekeeper heard the colonel say, she is quite clear about this. You will get nothing of hers, do you hear? Nothing. Jane, is it possible? Merrifield? It is possible, said Miss Marple, in a voice that meant it was not. Many things are possible, Dolly. It is also possible that a chimney should appear where none was before. One must simply attend to which possibility the house itself is pointing at. She set down the receiver, took up her shawl, and stepped out into the garden. The evening was warm and still. Somewhere at the end of the lane a gate creaked. Somewhere nearer a blackbird sang. Above the roofs of the cottages, above the rising mist of the water meadows, the sky was that particular pale mother of pearl in which one may still, if one looks carefully, see the last threads of the day's smoke going up from every chimney in the parish. Miss Marple counted them, absently, from long habit, the vicarage, the old rectory, Mrs. Price Ridley's, the Blue Boar, and thought, with a small and mild and unmistakable chill, that a chimney which had risen quietly for years without being counted was a chimney above a room which had for years been quietly used. She turned back toward the house. The parlour clock, striking the half-hour, sounded thin and precise across the garden. She would, she decided, walk up to Oakham Manor tomorrow. She would take Mrs. Bantry, and she would take her knitting, and she would ask, quite mildly, to be shown the long gallery on the first floor. Section 3. The panel that was not quite flush. She walked up to Oakham Manor the following morning, as she had promised herself, and she took Mrs. Bantry, and she took her knitting, and she took, in a small brown paper parcel, a jar of her own gooseberry preserve, which was the passport of a country lady into any house in the county. The morning was cooler than the last. A light wind had come up off the downs in the night, and the smoke from the eastern gable, when they turned into the drive, was no longer visible. Miss Marple noted its absence with the same mild interest with which she had noted its presence. Inspector Slack was already in the library, in loud consultation with his sergeant. Constable Polk, stationed in the hall like a large and mournful vase, admitted them with the resigned politeness of a man who has ceased to be surprised by anything. Mrs. Prothero Vane received them in the morning room. She was a slight, exceedingly pale woman in her middle 40s, dressed in dove grey rather than morning black. She had, she explained with a small, apologetic smile, no black that fitted, having lost a good deal of weight in the spring, and she took the jar of gooseberry preserve with a courtesy so automatic and so complete that Miss Marple was quite certain she had not, for the moment, the least idea what it was. "He was killed," Mrs. Prothero Vane said, in the same courteous voice, "between 10 and 11 o'clock last night. I was upstairs. I did not hear anything. I never do hear anything, you know. Hubert always said I slept like the dead." She paused, catching the phrase, and something moved in her face for perhaps a quarter of a second before her training reasserted itself. "How very kind of you to bring the preserve." Miss Marple, who was watching Mrs. Prothero Vane's hands rather than her face, the hands were resting in her lap with the particular flat stillness which she had observed in her long career only in women who had been struck often enough to learn not to flinch, asked, in her mildest tone, whether they might trouble her for a very small favour. Might they, before they went, be permitted to see the long gallery? Mrs. Bantry, she explained, had spoken so warmly of the portraits, and one heard so seldom in one's later years of a fine set of family portraits still in their original frames. Mrs. Prothero Vane hesitated. It was not, Miss Marple observed, a hesitation of unwillingness. It was the small pause of a woman calculating whether a room she has not entered for a long time is fit to be seen. Then she rose, smoothed her dove-grey skirt, and said, quite steadily, "Of course. This way." The long gallery ran the whole length of the first floor, along the eastern wing of the house. Its floor was of dark, polished oak, its ceiling low and cross-beamed. Its walls, on the western side, hung with the portraits Mrs. Bantry had indeed praised, and on the eastern side, the wall against which Iris Prothero Vane had stood, according to the housemaid, for 11 minutes, was of dark linen-fold panelling from floor to ceiling, blank, decorous, and entirely unbroken. Miss Marple walked the length of the gallery once with the slow, appreciative gait of an elderly lady admiring pictures. She paused before a stiff Elizabethan gentleman with a startled ruff, before a lady in Restoration ringlets, before a Regency child holding a rather anxious spaniel. She made small, pleased murmurs. She said the light was very fine. She said the frames had been beautifully kept. And then, quite by accident, she permitted her knitting bag to slip from her wrist, and she stooped to retrieve it. And in stooping, she brought her cheek within 9 inches of the linen-fold panelling on the eastern wall. And she remained thus, retying the ribbon of her bag, for the space of perhaps 2 full breaths. The panelling was of dark oak, oiled and polished, and it ran, as she had observed from the gallery's centre, in an unbroken line, with one exception. Between the 4th panel and the 5th from the northern end, there was a hairline seam of a slightly different colour, as though the join had been reset at some time in the last 100 years by a hand less skilled than the original craftsman's and had not quite matched the grain. Along the base of that same panel, upon the polished oak of the floor, there was, very faintly, discernible only to a woman who had spent 40 years watching her Gladys polish everything from silver to skirting boards, a semicircular scuff of some 3 inches, of the sort left by the constant small friction of a heavy object being swung outward and back. Miss Marple rose, smiled at Mrs. Prothero Vane, complimented her upon the ringlets of the Restoration lady, and permitted herself to be conducted back to the morning room. Mrs. Bantry, who had spent the entire tour in a state of controlled anxiety lest her friends say something dreadful, waited until they were once more in the drive before she seized Miss Marple's arm. "Well?" "There is," said Miss Marple placidly, "a door in the eastern wall of the long gallery. It is very well made, but it has been opened, dear, a good many times, and not lately by Mrs. Prothero Vane." "How on earth do you know that?" "Because she walked us past it, Dolly, without looking at it once. A woman who did not know the door was there would not look at it. A woman who used the door would glance, however briefly, to reassure herself that it was closed. Mrs. Prothero Vane did neither." Miss Marple settled her shawl. "She has, I think, been trained not to see it." They walked on a little in silence. At the bend of the drive, Miss Marple paused, apparently to admire a stand of rhododendrons, and glanced up once at the eastern gable. The chimney was there, exactly as before, its narrow shaft rising palely against the grey stone. She noted, as she had failed to note the previous morning, that the ivy about its base had been cut back, not weeks ago, but very recently, perhaps within the past 2 or 3 days, so that a person coming to look at it from below might see quite clearly that it was, as claimed, a chimney and not a chimney-shaped illusion. "Someone," she murmured, "has wished it to be seen." Inspector Slack overtook them at the gate in a motor that stopped with unnecessary abruptness. He had, he informed them, with the barely suppressed triumph of a man who has caught his sleeve on the truth, established that Dr. Merrifield had visited the manor at 9:30 the previous evening, ostensibly to see Miss Iris, and had remained in the house, the housekeeper was quite clear about this, until 11:12. The medical examination placed the Colonel's death between 10 and 11. Dr. Merrifield had, of course, offered an explanation, that he had spent the whole of that time in the small east sitting room with Miss Iris, discussing their future in the light of the Colonel's threats. Miss Iris had corroborated the account. So, curiously, had Mrs. Prothero Vane, who had claimed to have looked in briefly at 10:20 and to have seen them both there together. "Corroboration," said Inspector Slack, with the satisfaction of a man about to demolish a fortress, "is not evidence, Miss Marple. 3 people may agree upon a lie as readily as upon the truth. Rather more readily, in my experience." "How very true, Inspector," said Miss Marple. "How very true indeed." And then, after a moment's polite hesitation, "I wonder, has anyone yet asked the housekeeper whether the fire in the library was lit last night?" Slack blinked. "The fire? It was June, Miss Marple." "Precisely," she said. And yet a chimney which has not been used, one gathers, for some considerable time, was producing smoke at 6 o'clock in the morning. Somebody, Inspector, lit a fire in this house last night. Not in the library where the grate was cold, somewhere else. I should be very interested to know where. Inspector Slack looked at her for a full 3 seconds. Then he touched his hat, rather abruptly, and got back into his motor. As it drove away, gravel spitting, Mrs. Bantry murmured, "Jane, you have made him cross." "I know, dear," said Miss Marple, in a voice of the utmost gentleness. "But I am afraid we are going to make him a good deal crosser than that before we are done." Section 4. The Young Doctor at the Blue Boar. Before they were done, Miss Marple reflected, they would very possibly make a good many people cross. But crossness in a village was a small price for the truth, and the truth, though it moved slowly, had never yet failed to arrive at her door. She said as much to Mrs. Bantry as they walked back down the lane, and Mrs. Bantry, who was longing to be indignant on somebody's behalf, said with feeling that she trusted the truth would arrive before Inspector Slack arrested a perfectly nice young doctor for a murder he had almost certainly not committed. "Almost certainly," Miss Marple murmured. "That is such an important qualification, dear. One must never omit it." They parted at Mrs. Bantry's gate, and Miss Marple, instead of continuing home, turned aside at the Blue Boar. The public bar was empty at that hour. The private parlour, however, was not. Dr. Charles Merrifield was seated in the window, a cup of tea before him and a plate of untouched sandwiches beside it, and his face bore the particular grey pallor of a man who has not slept and is not going to sleep. He rose at once when he saw her. He was tall, dark, and not quite as young as village opinion made him, perhaps 30, with the fine, tired hands of a country doctor who did his own driving and mixed his own draughts and did not, as yet, own a nurse. "Miss Marple," he half smiled. "I thought I should be visited. I hardly hoped it would be by you." "May I sit down, Dr. Merrifield?" "Please." She sat. She unfolded her knitting. She did not, at first, look at him. "I have come," she said, in the mild voice she used with anxious curates and frightened parlourmaids, "to ask you 2 questions, if you will forgive an impertinent old woman. You may ask 20. 2 will be quite sufficient." She knitted 3 stitches, unhurried. "First, Dr. Merrifield, when you were with Miss Iris in the east sitting-room last night, at any time between 10 and 11 o'clock, did she leave your side for as much as 1 minute?" He hesitated. It was not, Miss Marple observed, the hesitation of guilt. It was the hesitation of a man deciding whether loyalty required a lie. At length he said quietly, "Yes, once. She went out. She said she wished to fetch a book from her uncle's study. She was gone perhaps 6 or 7 minutes, not longer. I remember because the clock struck the half-hour while she was out, and she returned before it had quite done striking 11. Miss Marple knitted 3 more stitches. "Thank you. Second question. When she returned, was there anything about her, anything at all, that you noticed?" He looked at her. "How did you know to ask that?" "Because there always is," said Miss Marple gently, "in the case of a person who has done something they had not meant to do." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice so low she leaned forward to catch it, "Her hands." She had washed her hands. In June, in a country house, at 10:30 at night, she had gone out to fetch a book and had come back with her hands newly washed. I could smell the carbolic soap on them. It is the soap they use in the scullery. And her sleeve, the cuff of her left sleeve, was damp. "Ah," said Miss Marple. She did not look pleased. She did not look displeased. She looked, if anything, sad. "And you have not," she said, "told Inspector Slack this?" "No." "Nor will you, I imagine?" "No." "Dr. Merrifield." She set her knitting down. Her hands, small and gnarled and remarkably steady, folded themselves upon it. "I must ask you one thing more, and then I shall trouble you no further. Do you love Iris Prothero Vane?" "With all my life." "Then I must beg you," said Miss Marple, "to be quite as careful of her in the coming days as you would be of a patient you feared to lose. Say nothing. Sign nothing. Answer only what is asked. And when Inspector Slack arrests you tomorrow, as I fear he will, for he has convinced himself and cannot easily now unconvince himself, do not, on any account, deny it in such a way as would draw his attention elsewhere. Do you understand me?" Merrifield looked at her a long moment. He was, she saw, a young man of considerable intelligence, and he understood her exactly. He said at last in a rather different voice, "You do not think she did it?" "I do not think," said Miss Marple, "that it was quite as simple as her doing it. But I think the 6 or 7 minutes were important, Dr. Merrifield, and I think the carbolic was important, and I think you were quite right not to speak of them. There is a difference, you know, between the person who commits a murder and the person who is used to commit one. It is a difference," she added mildly, gathering her knitting, "which the law does not always trouble to observe. But we shall." She rose. She thanked him for the sandwiches she had not eaten. She walked out into the yard of the Blue Boar, where a stable boy was rubbing down a horse and a black hen was making, with intent and dignity, for the kitchen door. Old Podgett was there also, cap in hand, in conversation with the landlord's wife. He touched his forelock to Miss Marple as she passed, and she paused to greet him. He was a squat, brown, weathered man of some 65 years, with hands like ancient roots and eyes that had seen too many gardens ruined by frost to be much surprised by a murder. "A sad business up at the Manor, Podgett," she said. "A sad business, Mum." "You were, I hear, in the Blue Boar last night with Mr. Beale?" "From 7:30 till closing, Mum. Mr. Beale will swear to it, and Mrs. Beddoes here." The landlord's wife nodded. "Then you can help me. Podgett, when did you last light a fire in the small chamber above the long gallery, the one with the narrow chimney?" Old Podgett's brown face did not change, but his hands, which had been rolling the brim of his cap slowly between his fingers, ceased to roll. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the stillness she had seen in Mrs. Prothero Vane's hands, and it meant, in a man of Podgett's kind, precisely the same thing, that he had been forbidden, over a long time, to admit that a certain thing existed. At length he said, without lifting his eyes, "There bain't no such chamber, Mum, above the gallery, nor no such chimney neither." "How very odd," said Miss Marple, "since I saw the chimney myself yesterday, quite clearly, and it was smoking." Old Podgett said nothing, but his hands began, very slowly, to roll the brim of his cap again, and he touched his forelock, and he shuffled away toward the stable-yard with the peculiar sideways gait of a man who has decided that the shortest route between 2 points is one that does not pass through a further question. Miss Marple watched him go with mild sorrow. She had not expected an answer. She had merely wished to see whether the question could be asked. It could. And that, she reflected, was very nearly as useful as an answer. She walked home slowly through the June afternoon. The village was quiet. The shadows of the elms lay long across the green. Somewhere a child was practicing, indifferently, a scale on an upright piano. She thought of Iris Prothero Vane's carbolic hands, of old Podgett's still fingers, of Mrs. Prothero Vane's dove-grey dress, and the flat stillness of a woman who had learned not to flinch, and above all, of the narrow chimney rising from a gable where no chimney had been. It was, she thought, like a piece of knitting in which one had inadvertently dropped a stitch a very long time ago. The whole pattern still held, but there was a small pulled place if one knew where to look, and once one had seen it, one could not, in decency, look away. She reached her own gate as the church clock struck 4. She let herself in. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the parlour window with her knitting on her lap, and she thought, very quietly and without haste, about who in that household had need of a second room, and for how long, and why the need had grown so urgent that a chimney which had been secret for perhaps 100 years had, this week, been permitted to smoke. Section 5. Ashes in a June grate. She had permitted the chimney to smoke for a reason, whoever she was. It was, Miss Marple thought, as she took the kettle from the hob, an act of very considerable calculation, of the sort committed only by a person who has decided that discovery has become preferable to concealment. That was not, in her experience, a decision women made lightly. Something must have shifted in the household within the last 4 or 5 days. Something the Colonel had said, or done, or threatened to do, which had made the long secret intolerable at last. She was still turning the thought over when Gladys, her housemaid, put her flushed young face round the door and announced, with the breathless importance of one who had run all the way up from the village, that Miss Iris from the Manor was at the gate and wished, if it were not troubling Madam, to speak with Madam privately. "Show her into the parlour, Gladys," said Miss Marple, "and then bring the tea in 10 minutes, not before. And Gladys, do not on any account listen at the door. I know you will wish to. Please do not." Miss Iris Prothero Vane, seen in daylight and in a small parlour, was less fragile than she had appeared in the stable yard. She was in her early 20s, dark-haired, straight-shouldered, with the kind of intelligent brown eyes that give a face plainer than they know a look of dignity. She was still in the green dress. She had not slept. The delicate skin below her lower lashes was a faint mauve. She sat on the edge of Miss Marple's horsehair chair as though on the edge of a cliff. "Miss Marple," she said, "I do not know why I have come to you, except that Charles told me that you had asked him questions this morning and that he had answered them, and that I should not lie to you if you asked me any." "How very kind of Charles," said Miss Marple. "Would you like some tea, dear?" "No, thank you, not yet." The girl clasped her hands very tightly in her lap. "I did not kill him. I want you to know that first. I did not kill my uncle." "I know, dear," said Miss Marple gently. Iris looked up sharply. "How?" "Because if you had, you would not have washed your hands." The girl went perfectly white, and then perfectly red, and then, after a moment, extraordinarily, she laughed, a short, surprised, unhappy laugh. "I see," she said. "Charles told you that too." "He did." "Then you know I went out." "I know you went out. I do not know where you went or what you did. I wonder whether you will tell me." Iris was silent for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice from which a great deal of pretence had been quietly removed, "I went upstairs, Miss Marple, to the long gallery. I opened the door in the eastern wall. I went through it, and up the 4 small steps, and into the room beyond, and I sat on the edge of the little iron bedstead there, and I held the hand of the woman lying on it, and I spoke to her for perhaps 3 minutes, and then I came away." Miss Marple set down her knitting. She did it with the same slow deliberation with which she had, an hour ago, poured the water into the teapot. "And the woman?" she said. "She is my mother," said Iris quietly. "My mother has been living in that room for 19 years. There was a very long silence in the parlour. In the garden a bee blundered against the window. Outside the church clock, patient as ever, dealt out the quarter. Miss Marple did not speak. She only permitted the words to rest in the room, as one permits a very heavy piece of furniture to settle upon a floor that has never before been asked to bear it. At length she said, "Tell me, Iris." The girl told her. The story, once begun, came from her in the low, steady voice of someone repeating a lesson learned in childhood and never spoken aloud. Her mother, Marian Prothero Vane, had been the Colonel's younger sister. She had, at 22, made what the family called an unwise marriage to a man named Alan Vane, no relation, an artist of some talent and very little money, who had died in a boating accident in Cornwall when Iris was 3. Marian, already fragile of health, had suffered a nervous collapse from which she had never entirely recovered. She had come to Oakham Manor, then the Colonel's newly inherited seat, with her small daughter, and she had been received, Iris said the word without emphasis, with the exact mixture of duty and disapproval that the Colonel dispensed to all things he had not chosen. He was ashamed of her, Iris said. Ashamed of the illness, ashamed of the marriage, ashamed of the whispers in the county. He told the neighbours she had gone abroad for her health. He told them so for so long and so consistently that they came to believe it and to forget her. And then, when the years passed and she did not die and did not recover, he had the room made. The room above the gallery. Yes, it had been a lumber room. He had it lined and papered and fitted, and he had the chimney built. It had never had one, you understand. The fireplace was inserted afterwards, for her comfort in winter, and he had the door in the panelling made by a joiner from Bristol who came only once, and was paid, my mother told me, a great deal of money to speak of it to no one. And there she has lived. Not a prisoner, Miss Marple, you must understand that. She could have gone at any time. She had a bell and a chair by the window, and books, and the housekeeper carried up her meals. But she was tired. She was tired of being looked at. She was tired of being the family's shame. And so she stayed. For 19 years. And I, said Iris, and her voice at last shook, I have known since I was 10 years old. He told me on my 10th birthday. He said I was old enough to be told. He said I must never speak of it. He said if I did, I would kill her. Miss Marple did not speak for some time. When she did, her voice was very level. And the chimney, Iris. The chimney has smoked this week. Why? Because I told him, the girl said, 3 days ago, that I would marry Charles whether he wished it or not. And he said, my uncle said, that if I did, he would send my mother to a home in Dorset that he had already spoken to. That very week. He had the papers, Miss Marple. He showed me the papers. He said she was a burden he had carried long enough, and that if I would not carry the family name as he wished, he would no longer carry her. And so? And so my mother, 3 nights ago, began to light her fire. Every night. All night. She said if she was to be sent away like a piece of shameful furniture, then let the village see her chimney at last. Let the village see that she had been there all along. Ah, said Miss Marple, very softly. She rose. She went to the window. The June sun lay warm on the sill, and on the pot of geraniums, and on the small china robin her mother had bought at Weston-super-Mare in 1878. She did not, for a moment, turn back. Iris, she said at length, I want you to answer me one thing, and I want you to answer it truthfully, though I know it will cost you something to do so. Last night, when you sat on your mother's bed and held her hand and spoke with her, did you tell her that the Colonel was already dead? The girl's hands in her lap went perfectly still. It was, Miss Marple noted with sorrow, the 3rd pair of hands in this house to have learned that particular stillness. Yes, said Iris at last, in a voice hardly above a whisper. I told her he was dead. I did not tell her how. I did not know how. I only knew when I passed the library door on my way upstairs that he was slumped in his chair, and that there was no port in his glass, though the decanter was full, and that his spectacles were folded upon the arm. And your mother? Said Miss Marple. What did your mother say? She said, whispered Iris, then it is finished, my darling. And she smiled. She has not smiled, Miss Marple, in 19 years. In the grate of Miss Marple's parlour, which had not been lit in a week, a small draught stirred the cold ashes with a sound like a woman turning over in her sleep. Miss Marple looked down at the ashes for a long moment, and thought that a chimney, once permitted to smoke, was a kind of confession, and that the person who had lit that fire had not been Marion Prothero Vane at all, but somebody who had wished, quite deliberately, that Marion's confession should be heard. Section 6. What the housekeeper had carried. It was Miss Marple's habit, upon receiving a confidence of any weight, to sit quite still for some minutes, and permit the several pieces of it to arrange themselves in her mind as they wished, rather than as she might have preferred. She sat so now, while Iris drank at last the tea that Gladys had brought in on tiptoe, and while the June afternoon deepened by imperceptible degrees toward evening. Then she rose, patted the girl's hand once, and said, I must call upon Mrs. Heppel, dear. Would you be so good as to walk back to the manor by the field path, and, on your way, do exactly 2 things. Please tell your mother that I hope most sincerely to have the honour of taking tea with her tomorrow afternoon, and please tell no one at all, not Charles, not Mrs. Prothero Vane, that you have been to see me today." Iris looked up. There were tears in her eyes, but her mouth was steady. "You believe me?" "I believe you, dear. That is not, I am afraid, quite the same thing as saying that I believe your mother, but I believe you." Mrs. Heppel, the housekeeper at Oakham Manor, was a widow of some 58 years who had come to the house in 1912 as an under-parlour-maid and had risen, by the slow gradient of country service, to the keys and the linen cupboard and the responsibility of the still-room. Miss Marple had known her since she was Emma Truscott of the lower village, a serious child with a squint who had been thought unlikely to marry and had surprised everyone, including herself, by making a very good and quite happy marriage indeed to a coachman who had died, alas, of pneumonia in the war. Miss Marple did not call at the front door of the manor. She called at the kitchen door at 5:30, when the tea things had gone up and the supper had not yet begun to be laid, and she asked Mrs. Heppel whether they might have 5 minutes together in the still-room where the copper pans were kept, and where, Miss Marple remembered from her one previous visit, there was a small window that looked directly up at the eastern gable. Mrs. Heppel showed her in without a word. She closed the door. She set 2 chairs. She waited. "Emma," Miss Marple said, using the girlhood name, "you have carried her meals up for 19 years, have you not?" Mrs. Heppel's mouth trembled once. She said, "Yes." "And you have said nothing?" "Not to a living soul, Miss Marple. Not one. The Colonel said it would be my place, and hers, and the poor lady's own peace, if I so much as breathed a word. And she was afraid of the world, ma'am. She was afraid of pity most of all. It was not so hard at first to keep. She wished it kept." "I do not doubt it, Emma. I do not for a moment doubt it." Miss Marple paused. "Tell me, did anybody else in this house, apart from yourself and the Colonel and Miss Iris, know that Mrs. Marion was upstairs?" Mrs. Heppel was silent for a long moment. She was, Miss Marple observed, considering not whether to answer, but how much of the answer she was entitled to give. At length she said, "Mrs. Prothero Vane knew. From the beginning. The Colonel told her before they were married. He said no woman should come into this house without knowing what was in it." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "And old Podgett knew. He had been groundsman when the room was made. He had helped the Bristol joiner with the woodwork. He never spoke of it. Not once in 20 years. Anyone else?" Mrs. Heppel hesitated. Then, in the same low, steady voice, "Mr. Ambrose, the Colonel's brother." Miss Marple set her hands very slowly upon her lap. "Ambrose Prothero Vane. I did not know he was still living. Nor does the village, Miss Marple. He has not been in this county for 18 years. There was some trouble. I never rightly knew what. Some trouble with the bank in London where he had a position. The Colonel paid, and Mr. Ambrose went abroad, and it was understood in the family that he was not to come back while the Colonel lived." "And has he?" The housekeeper's eyes lifted at last to Miss Marple's. "He came, ma'am. He came on Sunday. He came to the kitchen door at 4:30 in the afternoon. He asked to see the Colonel privately. The Colonel took him into the library and shut the door, and I could not help hearing, ma'am. I was polishing the corridor lamp. I heard Mr. Ambrose say, quite plain, 'You will keep your word, Hubert, or by God I will have it out of you.' And the Colonel laughed. And Mr. Ambrose went away, and no one has seen him since. But he has not, Miss Marple, gone very far, because the boot boy saw him yesterday morning at the crossroads by the Blue Boar, in a grey ulster, standing under the elm as though waiting for a person who did not come." A grey ulster. Miss Marple felt, for one brief, improper moment, sorry for Mrs. Price Ridley, whose foreign gentleman with a violin case had been, all along, an English gentleman with a suitcase, and whose only crime had been to be seen by an insufficiently attentive porter. "Emma," she said, "one thing more. I ask it not to trouble you, but because I must know. On Sunday night, the night before the Colonel died, did anybody in this house go up to Mrs. Marion's room, apart from yourself?" Mrs. Heppel's face closed. She said, "I do not know." "Emma." "I do not know for certain, Miss Marple, but when I took up her breakfast on Monday morning, there were 2 teacups on the little table by the window. 2, ma'am, not 1. She had used one, and someone else had used the other. She would not say who. She only smiled at me and said, 'Emma, dear, you must not ask.'" "And which cup," said Miss Marple quietly, "was the guest's?" "The blue one, ma'am, with the roses. She always uses the yellow." "And where is the blue cup now?" "Washed, ma'am. I washed it myself on Monday morning before the trouble." Miss Marple sat quite still. Somewhere outside, a stable clock chimed 6 with a distant, brassy dignity. She thought of the carbolic soap on Iris's hands, of the ivy cut back from the base of the chimney to make the smoke visible from below, of Ambrose Prothero Vane's grey ulster at the crossroads, of a blue teacup washed on Monday morning by a woman who had, for 19 years, washed only 1 cup where none but one had ever stood. And she thought, with a fresh chill under her shawl, that she had been quite wrong about a great many small things, and quite right about only one. That the murderer of Colonel Prothero Vane had needed the village to notice the chimney, and had needed it very badly, because the chimney's noticing was the whole point. "Emma," she said, "I must ask you not to speak of Mr. Ambrose to Inspector Slack. Not yet. Not until I've thought about it. Will you promise me?" "Yes, Miss Marple, though it may go hard with me if it comes out that I knew." "It will not come out through me, Emma. It will come out, if it comes out at all, through the person who wishes it to. And I think," she added, rising and taking up her shawl, "that person will not be long in wishing it." She walked home slowly, by the field path as the shadows lengthened. The evening was very still. The rooks were coming home to their high nests in the elms behind the vicarage, and the smell of new-mown hay was on the wind. Halfway across the lower meadow she paused and looked back at Oakham Manor, and saw, quite clearly against the pale evening sky, the narrow line of smoke rising once again from the eastern gable, thin, apologetic, persistent, as though the woman in the upper room, having smiled once in 19 years, meant, from now on, to be seen. But Miss Marple was thinking of Ambrose Prothero Vane's grey ulster, and of a promise that had not been kept, and of a laugh in a library on a Sunday afternoon, and she was thinking, with growing unease, that the smoke rising from that chimney was not, perhaps, being lit any longer by Marion's hand at all. Section 7. The Ulster in the Copse. The chimney was not being lit any longer by Marion's hand. Miss Marple was very nearly certain of it now, and she had scarcely reached her own gate, in the falling summer light, before the village provided her, with its usual generous inattention to her wishes, a further and much more dreadful confirmation of the fact. Gladys was at the door before her, breathless, cap askew. "Oh, madam," she said, "Constable Pork has been up looking for you. Twice. He says, will you please come at once to the copse below the manor, and please to bring your shawl, for it's turning chill, and please not to eat anything first, for it's not a sight for after supper, madam," he said. Miss Marple did not eat anything. She took her shawl. She took her stout black umbrella, which she had carried through worse things than an English evening. She permitted Gladys, who was tearful with importance, to go with her as far as the lower gate of the manor, and there she directed her, in a tone of absolute mildness that admitted no argument, to go home, put the kettle on, and wait. The copse lay in a shallow dell behind the stable yard, a small, dense stand of hazels and one very old yew threaded by a footpath that led, in a leisurely curve, to the crossroads by the Blue Boar. It was, in daylight, a favourite haunt of the manor cats. It was, this evening, ringed by 3 constables, 2 lanterns, and Inspector Slack, who was standing at the centre of the little clearing with his hat pushed back and his hands on his hips, and an expression of such profoundly injured astonishment that Miss Marple, in a less serious moment, would have been sorry for him. At his feet, laid decently upon the moss with a coat drawn to the chin, was Mr. Ambrose Prothero Vane. He was a small, silver-haired man of about 60, with the fine, weary features of a man who has lived a great deal upon his nerves and very little upon regular meals. He had been shot once, through the heart, at close range, with what Dr. Haydock, kneeling beside him with a hand at the wrist he no longer needed to feel, pronounced to be a small-caliber pistol, perhaps a service revolver of pre-war pattern. "Between 4 and 6 this afternoon," Haydock said briefly. "Not later. I'll be more precise tomorrow." "Well, Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack, with the elaborate courtesy he reserved for the moments when he most wished to be rid of her, "since you have made a point of asking about smoke and chimneys, and I do not know what all, perhaps you will now be kind enough to explain to me what a total stranger in a grey ulster is doing shot dead in this dell, not 200 yards from the front door of a house in which, 48 hours ago, its master was likewise found suddenly dead." "He is not a total stranger, Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, looking down. "He is Mr. Ambrose Prothero Vane. He was, the Colonel's younger brother." Slack stared at her. "Brother? There is no brother in the family papers, Miss Marple. Mrs. Prothero Vane herself told me." "Mrs. Prothero Vane," said Miss Marple, "has been trained for a great many years, Inspector, not to see certain things. It is not, precisely, her fault." Slack was silent for a long moment. He was not, in his own way, a stupid man. He was merely a man who preferred simple solutions and defended them past the point of prudence. He said at length, in a slightly altered voice, "You had better come with me back to the house, Miss Marple." They walked together up the path. The lanterns of the constables receded behind them into the trees, and the smell of the yew went with them a little way, and then the meadow smell of new-mown hay took over. Slack, on the way, said abruptly, "There were papers on him, in a leather case, bank papers, letters, a statement signed before a solicitor in Marseille, dated the 10th of May of this year. It appears, I have only glanced at it, that Colonel Prothero Vane, some 18 years ago, permitted his brother to be blamed for a certain irregularity at a bank in London, which had in fact been perpetrated by the Colonel himself. The brother went abroad rather than have their mother told. The Colonel paid him a small allowance to remain abroad. The allowance was, Ambrose says here, stopped 3 months ago. Ambrose returned, and Ambrose evidently meant to publish." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "yes, that would fit." "Fit what?" "Fit," she said, in her mildest tone, "the sort of man Colonel Prothero Vane was. A man who buys silences, Inspector, is a man who will eventually run out of coin." They passed under the stable archway. From the eastern gable of the manor, quite clearly against the last light of the sky, the thin ribbon of smoke was still rising. Miss Marple looked up at it once and said, more to herself than to Slack, "But he did not shoot his brother, of course. He was, by 4 o'clock this afternoon, 40 hours dead." Slack stopped short in the archway. "Then who?" "Precisely, Inspector. Then who?" They found the household assembled, in the drawing-room, in the peculiar stiff attitudes of people who have been kept together by police request rather than natural inclination. Mrs. Prothero Vane was on the sofa, still in dove grey, her hands folded with the same trained flatness in her lap. Iris was at the window, very pale, her eyes on the darkening garden. Dr. Merrifield stood behind her chair, one hand resting lightly on its back. Old Podgett was in the doorway to the servants' passage, cap in fist. Mrs. Heppel stood a little behind him. Constable Polk, breathing heavily, brought up the rear. Slack was brisk. He put questions. He established movements. Between 4 and 6 that afternoon, the doctor's window, Mrs. Prothero Vane, had been resting in her room. Mrs. Heppel had taken her a cup of tea at 4:30 and reported her lying down. Iris had been out. She had walked, she said, with only the smallest catch in her voice, to the village and back. The servants would confirm she had left at 3 and returned at 6:10. Dr. Merrifield had been at his surgery, seeing patients. 3 of them, at least, could be produced. Old Podgett had been in the kitchen garden, in sight of the scullery window from 4 until nearly 6, when he had come in for his tea. It was a peculiarity of country houses that everyone in them, on being asked, could account for themselves. And it was a further peculiarity that of the accounts given, in Miss Marple's long experience, precisely one was always a lie. She was not at this moment sure which. She was aware only that one member of the household had not been asked anything, and could not be asked anything, because she was upstairs behind a door that Inspector Slack did not yet know existed. Miss Marple opened her mouth and closed it. She glanced at Iris. Iris looked at her, once, with an expression of such helpless, wordless pleading that Miss Marple's heart hurt her. Then, in the silence, Mrs. Prothero Vane spoke. She had not spoken until then. Her voice, when it came, was perfectly steady, perfectly polite, and perfectly clear. "Inspector," she said, "there is one member of this household you have not spoken to. She is my husband's sister. Her name is Marion. She has lived for 19 years in a room above the long gallery, which has its own chimney and its own door. She has not been well. My husband did not wish it known, but she is there. And this afternoon, between 5 and 5:30, she was out of the house." The room went perfectly still. Iris took one step forward, and Dr. Merrifield's hand, on the back of her chair, tightened. Mrs. Heppel made a small sound of protest and stopped. Old Podgett looked at the floor. Slack, whose face had passed through 3 distinct colours in as many seconds, said hoarsely, "Out of the house, madam?" "Out of the house, Inspector," said Mrs. Prothero Vane. "I saw her from my window. She went across the lower lawn and into the copse. She was wearing my late husband's second-best overcoat, which she had taken from the hall cupboard yesterday morning. She was carrying in the pocket something heavy. I did not," she added, folding her hands still more flatly upon her dove-grey lap, "see her return." Iris cried out sharply once. Miss Marple did not turn to her. She was watching, with a stillness deeper than any of theirs, the face of Mrs. Prothero Vane, and she was thinking, with a slow and dreadful clarity, that a woman who has been struck often enough to learn not to flinch may also, given time enough, learn a great many things besides not flinching, and that the smoke from the eastern chimney had, all along, been rising for a purpose which Miss Marple had not, until this moment, correctly understood at all. Section 8. A cup of tea in the upper room. She had not, until this moment, correctly understood the smoke, but she understood, at least, what must now be done, and she did it with the quiet firmness of a woman who has been arranging altar flowers and diffusing scandals in the same parish for 40 years. She stepped forward. She addressed Inspector Slack. She said, "Inspector, before you go up to Mrs. Marion's room, and you must, of course, go up, I should like, if you will allow it, to be permitted 5 minutes with her first, alone. She has not spoken to a stranger in 19 years. If she is to speak to one now, I think it would be a kindness that it should be an old woman, and not a policeman." Slack, who had been about to refuse absolutely, saw Mrs. Heppel's face, and Iris's face, and the small, settled dignity of Miss Marple's own, and heard his own better sense speaking for once before his temper. He said gruffly, "5 minutes, Miss Marple, and Mrs. Heppel will take you up, and Constable Pork will stand at the foot of the gallery stair, and I shall be in the gallery itself. 5 minutes." "Thank you, Inspector. That is more than sufficient." Mrs. Heppel led her up. They passed through the hall, up the wide oak staircase, along the length of the long gallery, past the Elizabethan gentleman with his startled ruff, and the Restoration lady with her ringlets, and the anxious Regency spaniel. At the 5th panel from the northern end, Mrs. Heppel pressed her palm in a practised place against a small carved rosette which Miss Marple had not, on her earlier visit, particularly noticed, and the panel swung inward, on hinges as silent as a well-kept secret, revealing 4 small oak steps, and, at the top of them, a low painted door. Mrs. Heppel did not go through. She stood aside. She said, in a voice so low that Miss Marple only just caught it, "She will be waiting. She was told, ma'am, by Miss Iris that you might come." Miss Marple mounted the 4 small steps. She opened the low painted door. She went through. The upper room was not what she had expected. It was not a cell. It was not, indeed, in any obvious way, a sad room. It was a small, low-ceilinged chamber some 14 feet by 12, with a mullioned window looking east over the water meadows, a narrow iron bedstead neatly made, a chintz chair drawn to the window, a small round table with a workbox upon it, 3 shelves of books, Cowper, Trollope, a good many Brontes and a surprising Kipling, a japanned tea-caddy, and, on the small grate, a low fire of applewood burning with the peculiar sweet smell that only applewood gives. Everything in the room was clean, was cared for, was, in its own contained way, loved. Marion Prothero Vane was in the chintz chair. She rose as Miss Marple entered, and it was at once evident from the way she rose that she had risen day after day for 19 years for no visitor at all. She was a woman of perhaps 50, thin, silver-haired, with an old-fashioned sweetness of feature and eyes of the same intelligent brown as Iris's, though softened by a great deal of unshed patience. She wore a plain grey wool gown with a small lace collar. She smiled, the smile Iris had spoken of, and it was not a mad smile, and it was not a triumphant smile, and it was not, altogether, a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who has laid down, at last, a burden she had carried so long she had forgotten she was carrying it. "Miss Marple," she said, "how very kind of you to come. Will you take a cup of tea? Emma has left the pot warm." "Thank you, Marion. I should like that very much." They sat. The fire made its small applewood sound. Marion poured. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, were quite steady, not with the trained flat stillness of Mrs. Prothero Vane's or Mrs. Heppel's, but with a different and older stillness, the stillness of a person who had spent 19 years pouring tea for herself and no one else, and had learned to do it well. Miss Marple took the cup, the yellow cup, and set it down. She did not drink at once. She said, in a tone as mild as if they had been discussing seedlings at the vicarage, "Marion, dear, I have been asked by Inspector Slack to speak with you about Mr. Ambrose." Marion did not start. Her face did not change. She said, "Ah, yes, poor Ambrose. Iris told me last night that Hubert was dead. I was afraid, when she said it, that Ambrose might come to grief. You knew he had returned." "He came to see me, Miss Marple, on Sunday afternoon. Emma brought him up. He drank a cup of tea from the blue cup with the roses. He told me a great many things about my brother that I had not previously known. He was very gentle about it. He was, always, a gentle man." "And on the following night, Marion, the night Hubert died, did Ambrose come to see you again?" Marion looked down at her lap. She said quietly, "No, Miss Marple. Ambrose did not come to see me again. Ambrose had left the house on Sunday and gone, I understood, to lodgings in Much Benham. I did not see him again in this world." "And this afternoon, Marion? Between 4 and 6? Marion's brown eyes lifted. They were very clear. She said, "I was in this room, Miss Marple, as I have been for 19 years, between 4 and 6 of every afternoon. Emma brought me my tea at 4:30. I read a little Cowper. I sewed. I heard, at about 5:15, a shot from the direction of the copse. I did not know what it was. I thought it might be the boy at home farm scaring the rooks. I lit my fire, as I have lit it every evening this week, at 6. You did not go down. I have not been down these stairs, Miss Marple, Since the 7th of November, 1907. Because, she said, quite simply, if I am seen, Miss Marple, if I am known to have been in this house for 19 years, without a doctor, without a magistrate, without a signature, then my brother's will, by which he left the whole of this estate to Alice, becomes a matter which a good lawyer may reopen. My father's will, which left Ashcombe to be shared between Hubert and myself, was set aside upon the ground that I was of unsound mind. There is no medical record of it. There has never been. Alice has known for many years that if it could be established I had been kept here quietly and without any legal finding, the estate might, in the end, come to Iris. And Alice. Alice does not love Iris. Miss Marple set down her cup very gently on its saucer. Marion, she said, forgive me one more question, and I ask it because I must. On Monday morning, when Emma washed the blue teacup, the one your brother Ambrose had used on Sunday, did you ask her to wash it? No, Miss Marple. Did anybody go into your room, Marion, between Sunday night and Monday morning? Marion was silent. Then, after a very long moment, she said in a voice from which all the gentle patience had been quietly removed, yes, Alice came. She came up at about 11 o'clock on Sunday night. She had not been in this room, Miss Marple, in 11 years. She sat on that chair. She looked for a long time at the tea things on the table. She said to me, she said, Marion, dear, I think you have had a visitor. And then she went away. And in the morning, Emma took the blue cup down and washed it, and I did not think then to prevent her. Miss Marple rose. She did not smile. She said in a voice as quiet as the applewood fire, Thank you, Marion. You have been very good. I shall not, I think, need to trouble you again. She went down the 4 small oak steps. She closed the panel behind her. She walked the length of the long gallery, past the Elizabethan gentleman and the Regency spaniel, and she said, when she reached Inspector Slack at its far end, in a voice pitched low but perfectly steady, Inspector, Mrs. Marion did not shoot her brother. Mrs. Marion has not been out of that room since November of 1907. And Mrs. Prothero Vane, Alice, knew, when she gave you the account of the overcoat, that she was giving it about a woman who was physically incapable of leaving her chair. I think, Inspector, that Mrs. Prothero Vane will now be so good as to tell us, herself, where she was between 5 and 5:30 this afternoon. Section 9. The Pattern of the Smoke. Mrs. Prothero Vane, when Inspector Slack and Miss Marple came down the stairs together, was seated exactly where they had left her, on the drawing-room sofa, in dove grey, her hands folded flat in her lap. She had not, in the 20 minutes of their absence, changed her position by so much as an inch. It was, thought Miss Marple, as she took her seat opposite, a very fine performance. And it would have been a finer one still if the person watching had not known, from a lifetime of watching, exactly what it cost. Slack cleared his throat. He said, with a stiffness meant to disguise the deep discomfort of a man who has been publicly wrong, Mrs. Prothero Vane, certain statements have been made upstairs which do not accord with the statement you have given me. I must ask you to account, in detail, for your movements between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock this afternoon. Mrs. Prothero Vane did not blink. She said, I have already accounted for them, Inspector. I was resting. Mrs. Heppel has just told me, said Slack, that when she brought your tea at 4:30, your room was empty. The bed had not been lain upon. The window was open. Your outdoor shoes were not in their place. There was a small silence. Then Mrs. Prothero Vane said, in the same even voice, Emma is mistaken. Mrs. Heppel, who was in the doorway, went a slow, deep red and did not speak. You will forgive me, madam, said Slack, if I say that Emma has kept the linen of this house for 30 years without being mistaken about a bed. Mrs. Prothero Vane looked at Miss Marple. It was, Miss Marple noted, the first time she had done so directly all evening. Her eyes were pale, hazel, very slightly reddened at the rim, and they carried, for one clear moment, an expression Miss Marple had seen exactly twice before in her long life. Once in the eyes of a governess who had drowned a child in a rain barrel, and once in the eyes of a curate who had, over the course of 11 years, quietly poisoned his mother. It was not the expression of madness. It was the expression of a person who has for so long, and with such discipline, done what had to be done, that they can no longer conceive of any alternative course. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Prothero Vane, "I imagine you have your own view." "I have, Alice." "Then I should be obliged if you would state it." Miss Marple set her knitting on her lap. She looked, once, at Iris, who was still at the window, ashen, Dr. Merrifield's hand resting on her shoulder. She looked, once, at Mrs. Heppel, at old Podgett, at Constable Polk. She looked, last of all, at the small china clock on the mantelpiece, which was reading 9:15, and she thought that when it next struck the hour, a great many things in this house would be very differently arranged. "I will state it, Alice," she said. "You must correct me if I am wrong. You came into this house 22 years ago as the wife of a man you had not much loved but had considered eligible. He told you, before you married him, of Marion. He offered you a house, an income, a name, and a secret. You accepted all four. For some years, I think, you kept the bargain as it had been made. You were, as one gathers, a competent hostess and a discreet chatelaine, and if Hubert struck you occasionally, as I fear he did, you learned very quickly not to flinch, because a woman who flinches invites a second blow. You had, however, over the years, 3 grievances which grew. The first was that Hubert did not care for you. The second, that he did not care for Iris either, whom you had come, in your own quiet way, not to love, I am afraid, Alice, that you have never much loved Iris, but to resent, because Hubert had promised to leave you Ashcombe, and had, more than once, threatened to leave it, instead, to her. The third grievance was Marion herself. For 11 years you did not go into her room. But you knew she was there, and you knew, because you were an intelligent woman, and Hubert had not, in fact, married an intelligent woman by accident, you knew that if Marion ever became a matter of public record, the will under which Hubert held Ashcombe could be challenged. If Marion's confinement could be shown to have been irregular, no doctor, no magistrate, no signature, then the settlement upon her father's death, by which Hubert had received the whole estate on the ground of her incapacity, might be reopened. The estate, in that case, would very possibly pass, upon Hubert's death, to Iris, as the daughter of the sister who had been wrongfully set aside. And you would be left, Alice, a widow with a jointure. Comfortable, but not a great lady. 3 months ago, matters became urgent. Ambrose stopped receiving his allowance. Ambrose came home. Ambrose called upon Marion at 4:30 on Sunday afternoon, drank a cup of tea from the blue cup with the roses, and told her, as she has told me this evening, of certain matters which, in his hand, could be published to devastating effect. That evening, at 11, you went up to Marion's room. You saw the 2 teacups. You understood at once what had happened. You had thought, until then, that you had time, perhaps years, to arrange matters as you wished. You now had, at most, weeks. On Monday morning, Emma washed the blue cup, at your instruction, I imagine, though I have not asked, and shall not ask. On Monday afternoon, you began to prepare, and on Monday evening at 10:45, you went into the library, where Hubert was reading his general's memoirs, and you did what a woman in your position, a woman who has been struck for 22 years, is at last capable of doing. You did not use a weapon which could be found. You used something which every drawing-room in England contains and which no policeman thinks to look for. I believe it was the long steel needle from your workbox, the one, Alice, that you were embroidering monograms with on the afternoon we called. The wound at the base of the skull, Dr. Haydock will tell us tomorrow, was consistent with such an instrument. You returned to your room. You had not been absent above 5 minutes. Mrs. Prothero Vane's face had not moved. That, continued Miss Marple in the same mild voice, would have sufficed but for Ambrose. Ambrose knew things. Ambrose had signed a statement in Marseille. Ambrose was, moreover, seen by the boot boy at the crossroads on Tuesday morning, and would, sooner or later, come forward. So at 5 o'clock this afternoon, you went out, by the scullery door, which Emma had left ajar for the dairyman, and down through the kitchen garden and along the back of the yew hedge to the copse. You had, that morning, quietly taken your husband's service revolver from the gun cupboard in his dressing room. Ambrose was waiting under the elm at the crossroads, as he had waited yesterday, for whichever member of this house should be brave enough to come to him. You went to him. You spoke with him. You shot him. You returned to the house through the copse and the lower shrubbery, and you were in your bedroom, with your outdoor shoes back in their place by 20 to 6. And this evening, said Miss Marple, when it became clear that Inspector Slack was closing about the question of who had been out of the house between 4 and 6, you did the one thing you had always known you might, at the last, have to do. You gave him Marion. You gave him a woman who had lived 19 years upstairs for the sake of a family name. A woman whose testimony no jury in England would credit against your own. And you gave her to him wearing an overcoat you yourself had laid ready 3 days ago. But you gave her to him, Miss Marple added very gently, not knowing that the woman upstairs cannot walk down the 4 small oak steps of her own door, not knowing that Dr. Haydock, when he examines her tomorrow, will testify that Marion Prothero Vane has been, for at least a decade, incapable of walking further than the window of her own room. And not knowing, Alice, that when I asked her, half an hour ago, whether anybody had come into her room between Sunday night and Monday morning, she would answer me with your name. The applewood smoke, invisible, was rising from the eastern gable into the summer night. Somewhere far off a fox barked once. On the mantelpiece the small china clock, with a small china cough, prepared to strike the half-hour. Mrs. Prothero Vane looked for the first time tired. She looked, in fact, exactly as tired as a woman who has for 22 years not flinched. She said at last, in her own voice, a voice quite different from the one she had used all evening, "You are a very clever old woman, Miss Marple." "No, Alice," said Miss Marple gently. "I am only a very old one. It is a great advantage at my time of life to have known so many houses and so many women. There is very little that is truly new. There are only new arrangements of very old griefs." Section 10. 2 stories under one roof. There are only new arrangements of very old griefs, and the arrangement Mrs. Prothero Vane now made of hers was, at the last, a quieter one than the household had feared. She did not deny. She did not defend. She sat perfectly still on the sofa for the space of the clock's striking, and then, when its small china note had died out into the room, she folded her hands one final time upon her dove-grey lap, and she began, in the level voice of a woman reading aloud from a book she had written many years ago and never expected to be asked to read, to speak. She spoke first of Hubert. She had not, she said, killed him for money. That was a convenience, and she asked Inspector Slack to note that she was not offering it as a defence. She had killed him because on the previous Friday evening he had come into her bedroom with the papers for Marion's removal to Dorset, and because he had said to her, she remembered the exact words, with the exactness of a woman who has been struck often enough to remember exact words. "When I have got rid of my sister, my dear, I shall have got rid of the last of the women in this house who cost me anything. I hope you will take the hint." She had not, at the time, replied. She had waited until Monday night. She had used, as Miss Marple had said, the long steel needle from her workbox. He had not looked up from his book. He had not, at the last, been afraid. She spoke next of Ambrose. She had not known Ambrose in the old days. She had been told of him only after her marriage. She had learned of his return on Sunday morning from Emma, who had felt duty-bound to warn her. She had known, from that hour, that he was the one loose thread which could, if not cut, unravel everything. She had gone to the crossroads at 5 that afternoon. Ambrose, seeing her, had raised his hat with the fine old courtesy of his family and had said, "Alice, my dear." She had shot him once at very close range before he had finished the sentence. She had, she said, not permitted herself to consider what the sentence might have been. She spoke, last, of Marion. Here, for the first time, her voice was not quite level. She had lit the fire in Marion's chimney 4 nights running, she said, going up by the servants' stair while Emma was at her supper, entering by the panel with a duplicate she had had made in Bristol 9 years ago against just such a contingency. She had lit the fire because she had needed the village, at last, to notice the chimney, because a woman upstairs who was known to exist could be blamed for a great many things, whereas a woman upstairs who did not exist could not be blamed for anything at all. She had laid Hubert's overcoat in the linen room outside Marion's door. She had cut the ivy at the base of the eastern gable. She had, at every stage, been arranging Marion into a shape that would fit the story she meant to tell. "I did not," she said, and her hands, for the first time all evening, unfolded and refolded themselves once. "I did not, quite, mean her to hang. I meant her to be found unfit and taken away, and the estate to come, in the ordinary course, to me. It would have been kinder, Miss Marple, in its way, kinder than what she has had." "No, Alice," said Miss Marple, in a voice that was gentle and absolute. "It would not." Inspector Slack, who had listened throughout without interrupting, rose then and did what he had to do. Constable Polk moved from the doorway. Mrs. Prothero Vane rose also, quite steadily, and permitted her wrists to be taken. She looked, in the ordinary lamplight of the drawing-room, exactly as she had looked at 9:30 that morning, dove-grey, composed, mildly weary, and it was Miss Marple, watching, who thought that the most terrible thing about her was not what she had done, but that she had done it, as she had done everything else in her married life, without ever flinching. At the door, Mrs. Prothero Vane paused. She turned. She looked, not at Iris, but past her, at the window, where the last band of light lay along the crest of the water meadows. "Miss Marple," she said, "how did you know it was I who had lit the fire?" Marion herself did not know. She thought, she said, that Iris had lit it. Miss Marple set her knitting down. "Because, Alice," she said, "the smoke rose only in the evenings. Marion is a reader, and readers who live in one room learn to preserve their firewood. She would have lit a small fire in the mornings, when her hands were cold, and let it die by midday. The smoke from her fire, when she made one, was a morning smoke, short, small, and only on the coldest days. The smoke this week has been an evening smoke, long, steady, and continued through days that did not require it. Whoever was lighting that fire was not lighting it for warmth. They were lighting it to be seen." She paused. She added, more softly, "And a woman who lights a fire to be seen, Alice, is not the woman who lives above the chimney. She is the woman who lives below." The door closed. The motor of Inspector Slack's car crunched away down the drive. In the drawing-room, in the sudden released silence, Iris made a small sound and then, without warning, sat down abruptly on the carpet at the foot of Dr. Merrifield's chair. He knelt beside her. He did not speak. He simply held both her hands in one of his own and rested his other palm upon the crown of her head, as one shields a candle from a draught. Mrs. Heppel was weeping quietly into her apron. Old Podgett had not moved from the servants' doorway. He said at last in his rough Somerset voice, "There now, Mrs. Heppel, there now." Miss Marple rose. She gathered her knitting into her bag. She drew her shawl about her shoulders. She looked at Iris, and at Dr. Merrifield, and at Mrs. Heppel, and at old Podgett, and she said, in the calm tone of a woman closing a book she had at last finished reading, "There are 2 stories in every house, my dears. Very few houses tell you both. Ashcombe has been unusually honest with us this week. I think, if you will forgive an old woman's advice, that it should now be permitted to be quiet." She looked at the ceiling. Somewhere above the drawing room, in the room above the long gallery, Marion Prothero Vane was sitting in her chintz chair by the window, with her workbox on her lap and Cowper on the small round table and the applewood fire making its small applewood sound. And she was, Miss Marple was very certain of this, without needing to go up to see, looking east, over the water meadows, into a June evening which she had not seen otherwise than through mullioned glass for 19 years, and which she would, from now on, be at liberty to walk out into whenever she wished. "Iris," said Miss Marple, "your mother will be tired, but I think, tomorrow, she may care to come down to breakfast, very slowly, on Dr. Merrifield's arm. Do you think, dear, you could arrange it?" Iris looked up. Her face was wet, but the wetness had settled into the calm that comes after long weeping. She said, very quietly, "Yes, Miss Marple, I think I could arrange it." "Then I shall walk home," said Miss Marple. "It is a fine evening. Emma, would you be so kind as to see me to the gate?" Mrs. Heppel wiped her eyes on her apron and came forward. At the door of the drawing-room, Miss Marple paused and looked back once at the four of them, the young doctor kneeling beside the girl on the carpet, the housekeeper coming forward with an apron pressed to her face, the old gardener still in the doorway with his cap in his fist, and she felt, as she always felt at such moments, the peculiar mixture of grief and gratitude which had made her, for so many years, the quiet keeper of the village's darker knowledge. 2 stories, she said to herself, and one of them, at last, allowed to speak. She stepped out into the hall. Above her, through the ceiling, through the boards, through the panelling of the long gallery, the applewood smoke was still rising, steady and unhurried, from the eastern gable of Oakham Manor, into a sky that had, this week, seen more of it than in all the 19 years before. Section 11. The village at rest, and a chimney silent. The applewood smoke next morning was gone. Miss Marple noticed it as she took her breakfast at the parlour window. The eastern gable of Oakham Manor, from the distance of St. Mary Mead, showed only the ordinary Georgian dignity of its western chimney, rising steadily against a mild, grey summer sky. The narrow shaft on the eastern side stood empty. Somewhere in the upper room, one imagined, a fire had been permitted, at last, to go out, not because it was no longer needed, but because it was no longer needed to be seen. The village learned the essentials by mid-morning, in that particular way villages have, which is neither by newspaper nor by telegram, but by a slow, considerate diffusion from house to house, refined and softened as it passes. By 10 o'clock, Mrs. Price Ridley had informed 6 of her acquaintance that she had, from the first, suspected Mrs. Prothero Vane, and had merely been waiting for the police to catch up. By 11, Miss Hartnell had explained to the sexton that the whole matter had been foreseeable, and Miss Weatherby had confided to the postmistress that she had never, in truth, believed in the foreigner with the violin case. By noon, the strange man in the grey ulster had been quietly forgotten by everyone but the boot boy, who had, after all, been the only person to see him, and who now considered his 15 minutes of importance to be, he told his mother, the finest of his life to date. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement said to her husband, over the marmalade, "Len, are you not going to say anything at all about it?" And the vicar, who was that morning much occupied with the second lesson for evensong, said only, "Griselda, my dear, I shall preach on Ecclesiastes next Sunday, chapter 12. That will be sufficient." Miss Marple did not go up to Oakham. She had, she felt, been sufficiently at the manor for 1 week, and there were other calls upon her time. The Women's Institute jam competition, for one, was on Saturday, and her greengages had not yet been strained. She contented herself with sending, by Gladys, a small brown paper parcel to Mrs. Heppel, containing a fresh jar of gooseberry preserve and a card, upon which she had written, in her own small, clear hand, "For Marion, when she cares for it, J.M." The parcel was received at the kitchen door of the manor at 2:30. Mrs. Heppel, upon opening it, sat down at the scrubbed table and wept, without any interference from her apron, for the second time in 24 hours, And then she went upstairs and knocked at the low-painted door and delivered the jar to the woman inside, who received it with her usual grave sweetness and set it, without ceremony, upon the small round table beside Cooper. At 3:30, Dr. Merrifield came for Marion. He had spent the morning with Dr. Haydock, and the two of them had, between them, produced a report, dated that day, signed by both, witnessed by the vicar, which established beyond argument that Mrs. Marion Vane, née Prothero Vane, had been for a period of 19 years the subject of an entirely irregular domestic confinement, that she was of clear mind and gentle disposition, and that the small physical frailty of her legs, which had grown from long inactivity, was in no way incompatible with a slow and progressive return to ordinary life. He carried the report in his inside pocket as he ascended the wide oak staircase, but the report was for the lawyers, and the person he came for was not. Iris was waiting at the top of the gallery. Together they went to the panel with the small carved rosette and pressed it. Together they mounted the 4 small oak steps. Together they knocked at the low painted door and, upon being answered, went in. Marion rose from her chintz chair. She was in the plain grey wool gown with the small lace collar. Her silver hair was neatly parted. She looked, Iris said afterwards, exactly as she had looked all through Iris's childhood, a mother slightly too thin, slightly too quiet, entirely and unmistakably herself. She held out one hand to her daughter and the other to the young doctor she had never met until this hour, and she said, with a smile which was neither triumphant nor bewildered nor sad, but only, at last, a smile, "How very kind of you both. I think, if it is not too great a trouble, I should like to walk down." They walked her down. It took, from the low painted door to the front step of Oakham Manor, a full 20 minutes. She stopped 4 times upon the stairs. She stopped once in the gallery, to look, properly, without stealing at it, upon the Restoration lady with the ringlets, whom she had not seen in 19 years, and who had been, she told them, a great aunt of considerable temper. She stopped once at the drawing-room door, and glanced in, and glanced out again, and did not go in. She stopped, finally, upon the threshold of the great oak door, and drew a long, slow, careful breath of June air, of hay and box and roses and the faint, far-away smell of the water meadows, and she said, so softly that only Iris heard her, "So this is the outside." She stepped down onto the gravel. Old Podgett was there, cap in hand. He said only, "Ma'am," in his rough Somerset voice, but he said it in the way a man says the one word that has been dammed up in him for 20 years. Marion took his hand, one gnarled brown hand in her own, and pressed it once, and said, "Thank you, Podgett, for everything." And old Podgett, who had not wept since his wife had died in 1917, wept. She did not walk far that afternoon, only to the terrace where Mrs. Bantry, who had, by prior arrangement with Miss Marple, appeared quite as though by accident, greeted her with the perfect, unforced courtesy of a woman who had not, 5 days ago, known of her existence, and who had been fully briefed by Miss Marple as to how one greets, without pity and without embarrassment, a woman coming back into daylight after 19 years. "My dear Mrs. Vane," said Mrs. Bantry, "I am so very pleased to make your acquaintance. I hope you will forgive an old neighbour for having neglected you these many years. I mean to make up for it. Would you come to tea on Thursday?" Marion, quite steadily, said she would. At the parish church that Sunday, the vicar preached, as he had promised, upon Ecclesiastes chapter 12. He preached upon houses grown afraid of themselves and rooms grown dark for want of opening. He preached, in the mildest possible terms, upon the sin of secrecy kept for the sake of a name, and he preached, in even milder terms, upon the mercy of secrecy set aside for the sake of a soul. Miss Marple, in her usual pew, listened with attention. When the vicar had finished, Griselda Clement, in the pew behind, leaned forward and whispered, "Jane, did you tell him what to say?" And Miss Marple, without turning, whispered back, "Certainly not, Griselda dear. I merely lent him my Cooper. Colonel Prothero Vane and his brother Ambrose were buried, side by side, in the family plot at the top of the churchyard, upon a Wednesday in late June. The service was well attended, from curiosity rather than affection, but nobody, as Mrs. Bantry afterwards remarked, quite wept. Mrs. Prothero Vane was not present. She was, by then, in custody at Much Benham, awaiting the assizes. She had refused all visitors except her solicitor and, this was reported later, Miss Marple, whom she had received once, for half an hour, in a small, bare room with a table between them, and whom she had asked, at the end, only one question. "Miss Marple, if I had not lit the fires, would you still have known?" And Miss Marple had said, "Yes, Alice, in time, but you would have had a little more of it." At the assizes she was, of course, convicted. Of the colonel she was found guilty of murder, of Ambrose the same. The jury took 47 minutes. She was sentenced to be hanged, and, upon appeal, this was commuted to imprisonment for life. She died of a quiet pneumonia in the winter of her 11th year. Iris married Dr. Merrifield in the autumn in the parish church. Marion gave her away. Marion walked without a stick and with only a very slight limp the whole length of the aisle upon her daughter's arm, and Miss Marple, watching from her pew, thought that the small applewood smell that seemed to hang about her still, even out of doors, even in her best silk, was not, in fact, a smell at all, but only the memory of one, carried by a woman who had, for 19 years, made her single room a place worth keeping. Oakham Manor was sold in the spring following to a family from Warwickshire with 4 noisy children and a fondness for spaniels. The new mistress, a Mrs. Fortescue of considerable good sense, took down the panelling of the eastern wall of the long gallery, made of the upper room a nursery, and opened up the narrow eastern chimney to serve the schoolroom fire. From the meadows below, henceforth, 2 chimneys rose openly and honestly against the sky at every hour of the day. Miss Marple, in her parlour, took up her knitting once more. The bullfinch continued his depredations upon the gooseberries. Gladys continued to listen at doors and to be told not to. Mrs. Bantry continued to arrive at the gate in her motor with news that was not quite as urgent as she believed it to be. The village continued, but sometimes, of an evening, when the light lay long across the green and the smoke rose from the honest chimneys of the honest cottages, Miss Marple would pause in her knitting and look out towards the low hill where Ashcombe stood, and she would think of a room that was no longer a secret, and of a woman who had smiled after 19 years, and of a chimney that had been permitted, at last, to go out. And she would think, too, because she was a woman of long memory and few illusions, that every village has such a house, if one only knows where to look, and that the truest kindness one can do to a neighbour is not to leave them alone in their upper room, but to walk, very slowly, up their 4 small oak steps, and knock upon their low painted door, and ask them, quite mildly, if they would care to come down. The end.